Beneath a convent's silent bell tower, 117 women vanished into the soil, their names erased, their graves unmarked, their sins rewritten as salvation. A century later, the ground speaks back, revealing that what the church called mercy was nothing less than burial by prayer. The film opens in stillness. Archival footage, brittle and gray, flickers across the screen, a convent on a wind-stripped hill, its windows hollow, its bell tower sealed by rust. The camera lingers on the tower's silhouette against a pale Irish sky. Below it, rows of stone cottages sag into the earth, half swallowed by ivy and silence. The narrator's voice is calm, deliberate, the cadence of someone reading from an obituary that was never written. They say the bells of Street Verenas were forged in 1853, the voice begins. Cast for the call to prayer, not for mourning. In 14 years of operation, they never tolled for a single death. Wind fills the pause that follows. A flock of crows lifts from the roofline. In the next frame, the camera pans over the convent grounds, an orchard gone to skeleton branches, the faint shape of a courtyard cross leaning toward the soil. The sound design hums with restraint, the echo of water dripping through stone, the faint hiss of grainy film. As the narrator continues, the story shifts from image to absence. Parish records from the nearby town of Carragh list baptisms, marriages, and deaths, but between 1,892 and 1,906, there are no burial entries for the women of Street Verenas. 117 names entered the convent's register. None appeared again. The screen cuts to the convent's chapel interior, a single corridor lined with wooden pews warped by damp. At the far end stands the bell rope, frayed but unbroken, its fibers trembling in the draught. Every monastery keeps a rhythm, the narrator says softly. Prayer at dawn, work at noon, confession at dusk. But here, the rhythm stopped at the threshold of death. The sick were carried away, the bells stayed silent, and the earth above the convent remained untouched. The next shot lingers on a photograph dated 1902, 22 nuns standing in formation, their faces turned slightly from the camera. Their habits are immaculate, their hands hidden. Behind them, the bell tower looms. No names are written on the back of the photograph, only a single word, *Verena. Asterisk. Rain begins to fall across the film reel, streaking the image like tears across glass. The narrator's tone lowers, almost reverent. No funerals were held at Street Verenas. No procession, no tolling bell, no candle lit for the departed. In a place consecrated to mercy, death was treated as routine, and routine was never to be disturbed. The music swells faintly, a choral note stretched thin over the sound of the wind. The screen fades to black. In the archives, the voice concludes, they are listed simply as closed. 117 women whose final prayer was never heard, beneath the bells that never rang. Street Verena's hill rises above the northern coast, like a wound half-healed, its grass uneven, its soil too thin to grow trees. The convent that stood there was built from stone quarried out of the same hill, pale gray and pitted with salt from the sea wind. In the parish ledgers, its founding is recorded in one line, Convent of Street. Verena established for the correction and atonement of women led astray. Those words, written in a priest's looping hand, are the first trace of the institution that would swallow more than 100 lives. The Sisters of the Divine Restraint arrived in the spring of 1853, 12 women led by a French-born superior named Mother Elspeth Duhamel. They came not from any recognized order but from a small, private house of retreat in Calais, funded by an anonymous benefactor. Their rule was simple: silence, obedience, and labor. No member of the order ever took public vows, their service was inward, their purpose, the cleansing of the fallen. The local bishop approved the founding without inspection. To the church, the convent was an act of mercy. To the townspeople who watched the construction from the valley, it was a place to send shame away. By 1860, the convent walls enclosed a chapel, dormitory, laundry, and orchard. Carts arrived from nearby towns carrying women who had given birth out of wedlock, or spoken too freely in confession, or simply caused embarrassment to a family with influence. There were no trials, no sentences, only transfer. Each new arrival was told that her stay would last until her penance was complete. None were told how penance was measured. The Sisters of the Divine Restraint were rarely seen beyond their gates. Once a month, they sent crates of pressed linens and candles to local parishes, marked with the emblem of a bound dove. The emblem never appeared in official diocesan registers, suggesting the order operated outside canonical oversight. Records of correspondence between the convent and the bishopric cease abruptly after 1871. After that, Street Verenas became self-contained, an island of discipline, governed only by its own silence. When government inspectors first visited the site in 1909, decades after the last known entry in parish documents, they found the convent abandoned. Doors unbarred, beds made, dishes washed, as if the sisters had simply vanished in the middle of routine. No human remains were recorded, no archives recovered, only a single parchment framed above the chapel altar, its ink faded to brown. It read, asterisk, mercy without witness, atonement without end, asterisk. The Sisters of the Divine Restraint were never traced again. Their order was never recognized in Rome, their names absent from every surviving registry of religious houses. The Church would later claim no record of their existence beyond a single acknowledgement in 1854, a blessing of a charitable refuge for women in spiritual peril. But, within the boundaries of Street Verena's hill, mercy had become a sentence, and the silence that followed was its final prayer. They arrived at dawn, when the fog still hung over the road like a veil. A horse-drawn cart, wooden wheels grinding over gravel, carried its passengers up the narrow path to Street Verena's hill. The women sat shoulder to shoulder beneath a rough canvas cover, their hands bound not with rope but with prayer ribbons, white cloth printed with verses from the Psalms. They were not prisoners in the eyes of the law, but they were treated as if they were already condemned. The driver never spoke. The only sound was the turning of the wheels and the slow toll of the church in Cara far below, calling others to a mass they would never attend again. The convent received them through a small side gate known as the Pilgrim's Door, though no pilgrim had ever walked through it by choice. Admission to Street. Verena's required no court order, no confession, only a single letter stamped with a priest's seal. The wording was almost always the same, asterisk, for the preservation of her soul and the protection of the community. It is advised that she be placed in the care of the Sisters of the Divine Restraint, asterisk. Below that, a signature, sometimes a father's, sometimes a parish priest's, sometimes both. The women's own names followed like afterthoughts. Inside the gate, a nun would record their arrival in a small leather-bound book. No questions were asked, only measurements taken: height, weight, age, and a note about their sin. Unchaste. Disobedient. Unfit for marriage. Some were barely 16, others nearing 40, their stories different but their endings the same. Within minutes of crossing the threshold, they ceased to be daughters, wives, or mothers. They became penitents, assigned a number, stripped of their clothing and given the gray habit that erased them. Local villagers recalled seeing the carts ascend the hill but never return with passengers. Rumors grew that the convent operated a home for wayward women, a phrase whispered in drawing rooms with pity and relief. It was easier to believe that redemption waited at the top of the hill than to ask what happened after the doors closed. Families who sent their daughters there were told they would receive letters once their repentance was complete. Few ever did. For the women inside, time dissolved into ritual washing linens, kneeling in prayer, sewing until their fingers bled. The sisters called it work for the soul, but the silence that filled the halls was heavier than any penance. At night, the newer arrivals would whisper their names to one another, afraid they might forget them by morning. Some wrote initials onto the insides of their sleeves, tiny rebellions that went unseen until the habits were burned at the end of each season. No one outside the walls knew how many women arrived, only how few ever left. In parish sermons, priests spoke of street Verenas as a house of salvation. But the women who climbed that hill did not find salvation, they were delivered into disappearance. Each day at street Verenas began before the Sunday. The bell that summoned the sisters to prayer did not ring for mercy, only for order. The sound was thin and metallic, echoing down the dormitory corridor where 40 women slept on narrow cots under coarse wool blankets. When it rang, they rose without speaking. There was no greeting, no exchange of glances, only the scrape of bare feet on stone and the rustle of cloth as they dressed in their gray habits. At the sound of the second bell, they filed into the chapel for morning prayer, kneeling until their knees ached, reciting psalms that blurred into one another like rain on glass. Breakfast came in silence, a single piece of bread, a tin cup of watered milk, eaten beneath the eyes of Sister Agnes, who kept a ruler folded into her sleeve to enforce stillness. Afterward, the women were divided into their labors. Those with strong hands worked in the laundry, scrubbing until their knuckles split from the lime and lye. Others sewed linen for the local hospitals and the parish bedding, priestly robes and shrouds. They stitched for hours, their needles moving in unison, the rhythm like the ticking of a clock that measured nothing but obedience. At midday, the chapel bell rang again, not for prayer but for silence. The women were to pause whatever they were doing and bow their heads. It was called the hour of reflection, though reflection was forbidden. They were told to empty their minds of thought, to surrender to grace through labor. The sisters said that every stitch erased a sin, every washed sheet purified a soul. But when the workday ended, the ledgers showed no grace, only numbers, bales of linen sold, and coffins ordered. The carpentry room stood behind the laundry, separated by a locked door. No one but the senior sisters entered it, though the sound of saws and hammers filled the air long after dark. The women were told that the coffins were for the parish dead, yet none ever saw them carried out. Some whispered that they were practice pieces, never to be used, others that they were for the penitents themselves. Once, during a night storm, a door blew open, and a girl named Eileen glimpsed a row of finished boxes stacked along the wall, each marked with a small cross, but no name. The door was shut before she could speak, and by morning she was gone from her bed. Evening brought the last prayers, the women kneeling until their bodies swayed from exhaustion. The candles burned low, smoke gathering beneath the vaulted ceiling. When the final hymn ended, the Mother Superior extinguished the lights one by one, leaving the chapel in darkness. The day began and ended the same way, with the sound of a bell that promised redemption but delivered only repetition. Outside, the coffins waited in silence, their lids nailed shut against the truth that no one ever came to claim them. It began with dust. Thick layers of it clung to every surface in the diocesan archive, turning the air into something that tasted faintly of age and neglect. The archivist, a quiet man named William O'Dare, had been sent to catalog a recent donation from a defunct parish, boxes of ledgers, service books, and correspondence from the old Street Verena's convent. Most of the material was mundane: receipts for candles, delivery invoices for flour, handwritten notes about laundry orders. But at the bottom of one crate, wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax that had long since cracked, he found a smaller volume bound in black leather. Its spine bore no title, only a faint imprint of a cross, hand-pressed into the cover. The book was thin but heavy, its pages edged with soot as if they had once survived fire. Inside, the handwriting was precise and unhurried, the same hand repeated from the first page to the last. Each entry began with a name, a date, and an age. There were 117 in total, all female, recorded between 1892 and 1906. Beside each name, in the final column where burial locations should have been, appeared a single word written in deep, deliberate ink, times closed. At first, O'Dare thought it a bookkeeping term, perhaps meaning the case was completed or the file transferred. But as he compared the names against parish death records, confusion turned to dread. None of the women were listed as deceased. There were no burial permits, no funerals, no corresponding graves. To the church, they simply ceased to exist. The more he read, the more unsettling the pattern became. The entries were organized chronologically, but the handwriting never wavered. 15 years of script, unchanged, as if written by one person in a single sitting. The early pages carried details that suggested care. Mary Quinn, age 19, arrived ill, restored through prayer. Later entries grew stark. Anne Doran, age 28, quiet, closed. Catherine Byrne, 23, compliant, closed. Then, toward the final pages, the tone shifted again, almost mechanical. Unknown female, no record, closed. Some names had been scratched out, replaced by initials. Others had no name at all, just the date and the mark. O'Dare examined the back page, where a single sentence stood alone in the same careful hand. Asterisk. Each soul accounted, each door sealed. Asterisk. Beneath it was the signature of Mother Elspeth Duhamel, the last known superior of the Sisters of the Divine Restraint. The archivist felt the chill of something that defied bureaucratic explanation. The convent's own register had become an obituary for those who never received one, a litany of erased women reduced to a single word that sounded less like closure and more like command. He copied the entries onto fresh paper, one by one, as if rescuing them from extinction. But even as he did, he couldn't shake the sense that the book had not been meant to record death. It had been meant to hide it. In the margins of history, the women of Street Verenas were not declared dead. They were declared times closed. Asterisk. The discovery came quietly, almost by accident. William O'Dare, who had already spent weeks cataloging the remnants of Street Verenas, turned to the parish death ledgers hoping to match the names from the convent's Book of Rest. He expected errors, perhaps transfers, or simple clerical oversight. But the more pages he turned, the emptier the pattern became. Between 1,892 and 1,906, not one funeral was recorded for a woman listed in the convent's ledger. The churchyards of Cara, Dunvale, and Lisburn, all within a few miles of the hill, showed no corresponding burials. It was as though 117 women had lived, labored, and vanished without dying. He checked the indexes twice, then a third time, tracing each name with a fingertip. The paper rasped under his skin, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. No record, he muttered again and again, each repetition hollowing the words. When he cross-referenced the baptismal registers, the same pattern emerged. The women had once been christened, confessed, and counted among the faithful, yet in death their identities dissolved. The church had closed its books on them without ever opening the ground. Among archivists, absence speaks louder than presence. What O'Dare found wasn't a gap, it was an erasure. Parish records are meticulous by nature. Every death, even of paupers and orphans, noted with cause, date, and burial site. But the pages covering the convent's years were unnaturally clean. In the space where names should have been written, there was only ink bleed, faint outlines where lines might have been removed. Someone, at some point, had gone to great care to make the ledgers immaculate. He began to search outward, visiting neighboring parishes by train and coach, consulting grave registers and diocesan archives. Each search ended the same way, with polite confusion from priests who insisted there must be some mistake. If they were penitents, one said softly, then they were never truly part of the parish. Another, older and less cautious, murmured, perhaps confession freed them before death did. The phrase lingered in O'Dare's mind, confession as erasure, forgiveness as disappearance. It fit too perfectly with what the convent's own documents suggested. a place where sin was cleansed not through absolution but through annihilation. In his notes, O'Dare described the realization with the restraint of a man terrified by his own conclusion. "There are no funerals," he wrote. "No rites, no evidence of death or burial, only entries that end abruptly with the word times closed, asterisk." Later, when he returned to the diocesan office to present his findings, the room fell into silence. One priest looked away, another crossed himself. They all knew what that silence meant. It was not a clerical error, not a lost record. It was policy. The women of Street Verenas had not been forgotten. They had been deliberately unrecorded, stripped from the sacrament that marked the end of every Christian life. In a church where burial was the final proof of belonging, these women had been denied even that. They were not buried. They were buried times in absence. Asterisk confession had not saved them. It had erased them. Her name appeared only once in any official record, a fleeting note in a disciplinary report from 1898, written in a hand too delicate for the horror it described. Asterisk. Sister Agnes has taken charge of the penitent dormitory. Her methods are effective. Asterisk. For decades, she remained a ghostly figure within the story of Street Verenas, a rumor passed through whispers and footnotes. It was not until a bundle of letters surfaced in a private collection in Galway that her presence took form. The letters belonged to a woman named Bridget Kane, one of the few confirmed survivors of the convent. They were written between 1907 and 1910 to a cousin in America, and had been preserved only because the recipient could never bring herself to burn them. In the first letter, Bridget speaks cautiously of the woman they called Sister Agnes of the Veil. The title, she explains, came from the nun's habit, a black veil that extended past her shoulders and concealed most of her face, even indoors. The younger sisters said she wore it because of a burn suffered in childhood. Others believed it was penance, but Bridget's words suggest something else. She hides more than scars, the letter reads. When she speaks, the others listen like she is both priest and confessor. Sister Agnes kept a small black notebook bound in leather, never far from her hands. Bridget described seeing her write after night prayers, the candlelight trembling across the page as she recorded what she called the purifications. No one was permitted to read it, but rumors of its contents spread through the dormitory, the confessions of the fallen women, rewritten in the sisters' own words. She said the body must bear what the soul refuses, Bridget wrote. She said pain was the proof of repentance. Punishments were not loud or chaotic, but measured, ritualistic. Women who spoke after curfew were made to kneel through the night, arms outstretched in imitation of the crucifix. Those who resisted orders were sent to the laundry for days without sleep, working under buckets of scalding water until their skin blistered. One girl, a seamstress from Belfast, was locked in the drying room for so long that when the door opened, her lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. Sister Agnes recorded each act not as cruelty but as time's correction of the body asterisk, believing suffering cleansed what confession could not. Bridget's final letter, written years after her escape, carried a tremor of pity rather than hatred. She prayed more than any of them, she wrote. And when she punished us, she wept behind the veil. I think she believed she was saving us. Of the Black Journal, nothing was ever found, only a single scrap of paper discovered years later among the convent's ruins, scorched at the edges and written in the same precise hand, asterisk, to purify is to silence. To silence is to save, asterisk. The first record of illness appeared in the county health ledger for February 1894. It was written in the same spare, bureaucratic language used to note harvest shortages or cholera warnings. Asterisk, Convent of Street Verena's report of fever among residents. Contained without assistance. Asterisk, no physician's name followed, no confirmation of treatment, only the rubber stamp of the district office, and a brief note that the convent declined further inspection. The entry might have passed unnoticed had it not been followed by 6 more in the next decade, each phrased almost identically, each separated by precisely 2 years. In local memory, those winters were harsh and wet, the kind that spread influenza through tenements and schools. Yet the town of Cara reported no increase in mortality. The only place that seemed to suffer repeated outbreaks was the convent on the hill. The sisters referred to them as seasons of fever, though none of the women who fell ill were ever seen again. In the convent's own work logs, those same months show blank spaces, days without production, shipments delayed, names of workers erased. The pattern was too deliberate to be coincidence. Every time fever was reported, the Book of Rest gained new entries marked Times Closed, *. William O'Dare found the correspondence between the convent and the County Board of Health decades later. The letters were curt and defensive. When officials offered medical assistance, the Mother Superior replied that the sisters' isolation was protection enough. She assured them that the sick were attended in accordance with spiritual law. To outside authorities, the convent was a religious enclave, autonomous, self-sufficient, immune to scrutiny. Within those walls, sickness became both punishment and release. Survivor testimony, though rare, filled the silence left by missing records. One former novice, interviewed in 1932, recalled the fevers not as disease, but as disappearance. They said it was God's testing, she told investigators. But the ones who burned in their beds never had graves. They just stopped being spoken of. Another witness, a visiting carpenter who repaired the convent roof, described the faint smell of lime drifting from behind the orchard walls during one of the outbreaks. Like someone cleaning something too well, he said. No doctor ever signed a death certificate for the women of Street Verenas. The absence was systemic, not accidental. The church required clerical authorization for burial, but the sisters issued their own permissions, handwritten slips that referred to deliverance, not death. By defining illness as sin and recovery as silence, they removed the need for physicians altogether. In the regional archives, the last recorded epidemic at Street Verenas appears in 1906. It ends, as the others did, with the phrase "times contained without assistance." *. After that, the convent vanished from public record entirely. Whatever burned through those dormitories did not leave scars on paper, only the faint echo of a word whispered in every entry, contained. To the church, it meant the fever had passed. To history, it meant the truth never escaped. The orchard had long since turned to ruin by the time the men arrived in the summer of 1924. The trees were gnarled and split, their roots pushing through stone paths that once led to the convent's rear gate. A team of laborers had been hired to clear the overgrowth and prepare the land for a new retreat house, funded by the diocese as part of a quiet restoration project. The foreman, Michael Gaffney, was a practical man, uninterested in local rumors about the place. He had been told only to level the ground and make the soil ready for planting again. On the third day, while digging near the old orchard wall, one of his men struck stone. At first, they thought it was a foundation part of the convent's outer structure buried by time. But as they cleared the earth, the wall revealed itself to be different. The masonry was older than the rest of the buildings, its surface sealed with a thick layer of lime. There was no door, no marking, no purpose they could identify. When Gaffney sent a man for a chisel, the others joked nervously that they were prying open the gates of hell. The first crack in the wall released a smell so faint and dry that it seemed more memory than air. Beneath the surface, the mortar crumbled like bone dust. Behind the wall lay a cavity no larger than a storeroom. The light of their lanterns fell on shapes piled close together, some wrapped in fragments of linen, others bare. The bones were small, consistent in size, delicate wrists, narrow ribs, skulls that could have belonged to children or women of slight frame. No rosaries hung among them, no markers of identity. Just the orderliness of deliberate concealment. Gaffney, a veteran of the Great War, later told a journalist that he had seen worse sights on the battlefield but never such silence. They were laid there careful, he said, like someone meant them to be forgotten, not mourned. The discovery should have halted the project, but within hours the local constabulary arrived with a priest from the Carrig parish. The site was examined briefly, sketched in one official notebook, and declared a historical burial enclosure of uncertain origin. 2 days later, laborers were ordered to reseal the wall and fill the excavation. The bones were left where they had been found. The lime packed back into the cracks, the orchard replanted over them. No inquest followed, no coroner was summoned. The diocese issued a brief statement noting that ancient remains consistent with monastic burials had been found and respectfully reinterred. But those who worked the site knew what they had seen. The skeletons were too uniform, too recent, the linen too well preserved. At night, Gaffney's crew swore they heard the bell tower creak though the wind was still. When the project finished, the new retreat opened on schedule, the orchard blooming again as if the ground had not just been filled with silence. And beneath the blossoms, the wall remained sealed for the second time, exactly as the church had instructed. By 1930, the name of the Sisters of the Divine Restraint had all but vanished from church directories, as if the order had never existed. Their convent at St. Verena's Hill stood empty, its windows shuttered, its gates chained but unguarded. The diocese's annual report from that year mentioned the closure only once, buried between notes on charitable donations and parish repairs. Asterisk. The Sisters of the Divine Restraint, having completed their mission, are to be reallocated at the discretion of higher authorities. Asterisk. No public statement followed, no ceremony of farewell. The order dissolved not with scandal, but with silence. Within the church, silence could serve as both shield and absolution. The files that might have explained the dissolution were sealed under the pretext of internal restructuring. The bishop, who had once overseen the convent, was transferred to a post in Belgium. His successor claimed no knowledge of the order beyond a small community of women devoted to penitential service. The archives listed them as inactive, and then, a year later, erased them altogether. Yet traces of the sisters persisted in unlikely places. In 1932, a small cloister opened outside Lyon under the name of the Servants of Divine Contemplation. Its founding members included 2 nuns whose handwriting matched that of the St. Verena's records. In Germany, a hospice run by the Handmaids of Mercy recorded a donation from a woman signing herself, Sister Agnes, late of Verena's Hill. None of these institutions acknowledged any connection, yet their rules were strikingly similar. Silence at all meals, no external visitors, no confessions heard by clergy outside the order. They called their vows private, but what they practiced was exile. Investigators who later tried to trace the sisters' movements found the trail fragmentary and contradictory. The church provided new names and new identities, dispersing them across Europe like ashes. Some took positions as nurses and midwives under assumed convent titles. Others disappeared into monasteries that accepted them without question. By the late 1932s, even the Vatican's registries failed to list the order or its successor houses. It was as if the women had been deliberately scattered, each carrying a piece of St. Verena's with her buried under layers of sanctioned forgetting. The few documents that survived suggest that the order's dissolution was not punishment but protection. An unsigned memorandum in Latin, discovered decades later in the Congregation for Religious Life, reads, Asterisk. It is deemed prudent that the sisters be relieved of association with the late establishment at Verena's Hill. Their obedience is intact, their vows remain valid. Asterisk. The wording is careful, almost tender. The church had not disowned them, it had hidden them. No graves were ever marked for the women they once ruled, and no record marked the departure of the sisters who presided over them. They faded into new names, new languages, and new habits, carrying their silence as the last relic of their faith. By the time the century turned, the world remembered St. Verena's only as rumor, and the order that had built it as myth. The Sisters of the Divine Restraint had fulfilled their vow at last. They had restrained even their own existence. The story of street Verenas might have remained buried if not for a retired Garda officer named Thomas Kearney. By 1956, Kearney was an old man, living alone in a small stone cottage near Galway Bay, but his reputation for persistence had outlasted his years in service. He had once investigated missing persons, a specialization that left him with an obsession for patterns names that appeared, disappeared, and then reappeared in the margins of bureaucracy. One winter evening, while sifting through discarded diocesan files for a local historian, he came across a folder labeled Times, Confidential, Losses, *. The title caught his attention. Inside were letters written between 1894 and 1906, dates that aligned with the last years of the convent on Street Verena's Hill. The correspondence was curt, businesslike. Each letter carried the same header, Sisters of the Divine Restraint *, and the same signature in looping script, Mother Elspeth Duhamel. The contents spoke not of devotion but of arithmetic. Phrases like necessary expenses for containment and renewal of maintenance stipend repeated across the pages. The most chilling line appeared in a note from 1904 addressed to the Bishop of Carrag, *. The recent losses have been reconciled. All matters now at rest. There were no details, no names, only that word losses used not in mourning but as ledger entry. Kearney, skeptical of superstition but haunted by precision, began to dig. He spent months requesting records from the diocesan archives, posing as a genealogical researcher. What he found deepened the unease. The death registers for the convent's district were incomplete, pages missing at exact intervals that matched the years listed in the correspondence. When he traced property deeds, he discovered that the convent's land had been quietly transferred to the church's charitable trust just 2 years before its closure, signed by an intermediary who no longer existed in civil records. His private notes, later recovered from his home, reveal the evolution of his investigation from curiosity to obsession. Pattern of concealment systemic, one entry reads. Losses equals deaths. Payment structure suggests ongoing cover. In another he writes, need confirmation from Rome, files local sources obstructed. By mid-1957, he had compiled a 70-page report titled Times, The Ledger of Losses, an inquiry into Street Verena's Convent and associated correspondence, *. It contained copies of the letters, annotated parish extracts, and a timeline linking each outbreak of fever, with payments sent from diocesan accounts labeled Times, Confidential Maintenance, *. Kearney submitted the report to the Department of Justice and to the Archdiocese of Dublin. Within 2 weeks, officials visited his home and removed every document under the pretense of national security. He was told the matter involved ecclesiastical privilege. Neighbors recalled seeing him after that day sitting by the fire, the same pipe unlit between his teeth, the light gone out of his eyes. When he died in 1961, the Garda found his personal journals burned in the hearth and a single scrap of paper pinned to the mantelpiece. In his unmistakable hand were 4 words, *, the losses were human, *. It surfaced by accident in 1971, folded between the pages of an estate ledger donated to the National Library in Dublin. The archivist who found it almost dismissed it as scrap one torn, water-stained sheet of paper, its edges browned by age. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the ink pressed deep into the fibers, as if written with conviction rather than haste. There was no heading, no signature, only 2 lines of text centered on the page. *. No confession can cleanse a womb that defies command. The soil receives what the church cannot forgive. *. At first, the archivist assumed it to be a fragment of a sermon or a private reflection, but the paper's watermark matched stationery known to have been used by the Sisters of the Divine Restraint. The discovery was sent to the diocesan archives for authentication, Where it might have vanished again had a young historian named Aidan Coyle not noticed the handwriting. Coyle had been studying work records from St. Verena's Hill, specifically the laundry ledgers kept between 1894 and 1901. When he compared the entries side by side, the resemblance was unmistakable. The same hand that had signed for linen deliveries, the same precise curvature of letters, the same decisive downward stroke of the S. It was the handwriting of Sister Agnes. The implications were chilling. The convent's internal documents had always described Agnes as meticulous, devout, and unsparing, a woman entrusted with maintaining order. But this fragment revealed something deeper, a theology twisted into justification. Scholars debated its meaning. Was it confession or decree? Some suggested it reflected an obsession with purity, others a coded admission of burial practices within the convent. The phrasing the soil receives struck too close to the rumors of the orchard wall to be coincidence. Coyle tracked the provenance of the page back to a private solicitor's collection that once handled church properties during post-war consolidations. One file, labeled Times Bethlehem Holdings Street, Verena's estate contained other references to missing documents and restricted spiritual correspondence. It appeared the page had been misfiled for decades, surviving only because no one recognized its significance. When word of the find reached the archdiocese, officials swiftly requested its return. Coyle refused. He made a copy, depositing it in the university archives under the label Anonymous Reflection, circa 1900. In the years that followed, theologians quoted the passage in debates over the Church's authority to define sin, but most quietly withdrew their citations when inquiries were made about its source. To the Church, it was blasphemy. To historians, it was confession. The original sheet disappeared sometime in the late 1982, removed from its protective sleeve by an unknown visitor. Only the photograph remains grainy, faint, but legible. At the bottom of the page, beneath the two lines of text, a faint indentation is visible under strong light, as if a hand had pressed down to end a thought unfinished. The indentation reads only 3 words, forgive the soil, The ink in the Book of Rest faded unevenly, but one feature never changed. Every entry, from the first to the last, bore the same looping signature at the bottom of the page times M. Elspeth Duhamel, The strokes were deliberate, unhurried, each flourish of the pen identical, as if written in a single sitting rather than over 14 years. Her name closed every life the convent recorded. Each woman entered, lived, vanished, and at the end, Elspeth's hand wrote the same word beside them times closed, Very little survives of the woman herself beyond that repetition. The Church's personnel registers list her birth in Calais, 1845, and note her arrival in Ireland as part of a founding mission of penitential vocation. She was 28 when she established St. Verena's Hill under the newly formed Sisters of the Divine Restraint. Witness accounts from parish visits describe her as soft-spoken but absolute, a woman of striking composure who never raised her voice, yet never allowed disobedience to live long enough to repeat itself. One report from 1895 refers to her only as times the quiet one with keys, The Book of Rest bears the texture of her order's philosophy, clean lines, efficient endings, no elaboration. Where another institution might have written, died, transferred, or released, street. Verena's used a single word, closed. It was not a statement of death but of completion, a sealing off of narrative. In Elspeth's theology, sin was a ledger, the body entered in deficit, the spirit was balanced through obedience, and when the account was reconciled, it was closed. To question her was to question divine arithmetic. When modern historians examined the few documents that survived her lifetime, they found evidence of financial precision bordering on obsession. Her correspondence with the diocesan treasurer includes monthly updates written in her narrow, slanted script, each ending with the phrase, asterisk, all matters reconciled. Asterisk. It appeared in her letters as it did in her ledgers, an incantation of order, spoken not from faith but from necessity. The last of these letters is dated February 1906, 3 months before her recorded death. Her death certificate is peculiar in its brevity. Asterisk, Elspeth Duhamel, aged 61. Cause, fatigue of the heart. Occupation, in service. Asterisk. The signature below belongs to a visiting physician whose practice ceased the same year. There is no burial record, no funeral notice, no mention in diocesan bulletins. Yet her handwriting continues in the Book of Rest until its final page, where the last entry reads simply, asterisk, unknown female. Closed. Asterisk. The line below, reserved for her signature, carries a smudge of ink that bleeds into the margin an unfinished flourish, as though the hand that wrote it faltered mid-stroke. Scholars have argued that the smudge marks the moment of her death, the ink capturing the literal breath between control and collapse. Others believe it was added later by someone imitating her hand to maintain continuity. Either way, the effect is chilling, a book of the dead that ends with the author's own silence. After 1906, the order's handwriting changes. The strokes lose their certainty. The replacements sign only their initials, never the full name. Elspeth Duhamel, the woman who signed away 117 lives, vanished into the same quiet she imposed on them. Her death, like theirs, was recorded not as tragedy but as conclusion, an entry neatly sealed beneath the words she had written so many times before. Asterisk closed. Asterisk. The trail began in the midwives' registers of Carra Hospital, a modest red brick building that had served as the medical arm of Street Verena's Hill. For years, its ledgers recorded births from across the district, but the pattern that emerged startled even seasoned archivists. Between 1892 and 1906, the same years the convent's Book of Rest was active, 67 infants were listed as born under care of the sisters. Each entry bore the notation times mother unidentified, asterisk followed by the initials SV. None of the births were followed by a TP/CZZ. Corresponding baptism or burial. In a time when infant mortality was high, every life and death was usually accounted for, if only to satisfy church formality. Yet here the births appeared without endings, as if the children had simply never left the pages that recorded them. Researchers who later examined the hospital's archives found that the maternity ward had been administratively separate from the rest of the building. It was staffed exclusively by nuns, and access was restricted even to visiting physicians. Deliveries took place in a narrow annex behind the laundry, where the walls were lined with shelves of linen marked Times penitent use only. Asterisk. Officially, it functioned as a charitable refuge for unmarried women, a place to give birth discreetly and reclaim spiritual purity. In practice, it was another chamber of silence. Testimony gathered decades later from one surviving nurse hinted at what that silence contained. She recalled nights when the wind off the sea carried faint crying from the annex, followed by the slow toll of the small handbell the sisters used for prayers. "You'd hear it once," she said, "and then nothing after." When she asked where the infants were sent, the Mother Superior told her they were taken to a parish orphanage in Sligo. But no such records exist in Sligo's archives, and none of the surrounding orphanages list transfers from Street Verenas. The same gap repeats in baptismal records: 67 births, 0 christenings. Some historians have suggested that the infants were stillborn and buried on the grounds, their deaths unrecorded to protect the mothers' reputations. Others suspect something darker, that the convent's definition of purification extended beyond the women themselves. The phrasing in Sister Agnes's recovered fragment asterisk, "The soil receives what the church cannot forgive," asterisk now seemed less metaphor than instruction. If the orchard wall concealed the bodies of the mothers, the soil beneath it may have hidden their children too. When investigators compared the handwriting in the hospital ledgers to that of the Book of Rest, they found identical penmanship, each infant's entry written in the same precise script as the mothers' names. The same hand that closed the women's lives had recorded their children's beginnings. The realization reframed the numbers entirely. Perhaps the 117 listed in the Book of Rest were not all women. Perhaps some were the unbaptized, unnamed infants whose cries ended before their first sunrise. The documentary returns, in this chapter, to the orchard. The camera lingers over the soil, dark and unbroken, while the narrator's voice falls to a whisper. If the earth beneath street. Verena's holds the women who labored in silence, then somewhere, among their folded hands, lie the children who were never counted. And in that arithmetic of mercy, the church buried not just their bodies, but their beginnings. In the spring of 1973, the Irish State Commission on Institutional Abuse was still in its infancy, a cautious body tasked with examining rumors that had shadowed the church for decades. Most of the letters it received were unremarkable: claims of mistreatment, old grievances, appeals for lost records. But one envelope, thin and unmarked, arrived without return address or postmark. It contained a single page of typed text and, clipped to it, a carbon copy of a cable bearing the insignia of the Secretariat of State in Vatican City. The cover letter, unsigned, opened with 6 words that would haunt the archivist who first read them. Asterisk. The convent with no funerals still lies. Asterisk. The cable itself was brief, dated the 4th of June 1908, and addressed to the Diocese of Dublin. It read, in formal diplomatic phrasing, asterisk, matters of Verena's Hill are resolved within the order. No external correspondence is warranted. Rome acknowledges the cessation. Asterisk. Below the message was a faded signature block, no name. Only the designation Times Cardinal Prefect, Congregation for Religious Life. Asterisk. The tone was administrative. Dismissive, the sort of language used to close internal audits. But to anyone familiar with street Verenas, the implications were unmistakable. The Vatican had known of the convent's activities and, rather than condemn them, had chosen silence. The commission's secretary, a civil servant named Moira Larkin, logged the letter into the archive under unverified correspondence and quietly requested access to diocesan files from the 1900s. Within days, she received a courteous refusal. The commission lacked jurisdiction over closed religious houses, the church explained, and such historical matters fell outside the purview of temporal authority. Larkin pushed no further. Her colleagues advised against provoking conflict with Rome. The envelope and its contents were filed away, unread by any investigator, their existence noted only in a single line of the Commission's annual summary. Asterisk. Received anonymous allegation concerning historical convent activity, unverifiable. Years later, when researchers uncovered the entry, they traced the cable's format and code structure. The phrasing matched official Vatican communications from the early 20th century, authentic down to the spacing between words. It was not a forgery. The cable's reference to cessation coincided precisely with the date the Order of the Sisters of the Divine Restraint was dissolved. To church historians, it appeared to be confirmation that St. Verena's Hill had been quietly extinguished with full papal awareness. No one ever identified the source of the letter. Some speculated it came from within the clergy itself, perhaps from a dying priest burdened by memory. Others believed it was sent by a former nun who had outlived her silence. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. Nothing changed. The commission, overwhelmed by contemporary scandals, archived the letter under a classification labeled Times Non-Actionable Historical Content, asterisk. And so, as official inquiries multiplied in the decades that followed, the story of Street Verenas remained outside every report, sealed once again by the same institution that had created it. The cable's final sentence, asterisk, matters of Verena's Hill, are resolved within the order. Asterisk stood as the church's epitaph to a century of quiet atrocity. Resolved, in the Vatican's language, meant finished. But in Ireland's soil, beneath the orchard where the walls still slept, nothing had ever been resolved at all. It was almost a century after the convent's doors had closed when the ground at Street Verena's hill stirred again, not from faith, but from bureaucracy. In 1998, a private development firm commissioned to build a small retreat center began a routine geological survey of the land. The site had been abandoned for decades, its orchard overrun by weeds, the old convent reduced to a shell of stone walls and silence. The survey team expected nothing more than uneven soil and remnants of forgotten foundations. Instead, the radar began to draw ghosts beneath the surface. The technician operating the ground-penetrating scanner noticed the first anomaly near the southern edge of the orchard, a narrow oval pocket of compacted soil distinct from the rest of the terrain. Then came another, and another. By the end of the day, the machine had registered 27 distinct shapes, each less than 2 meters long, arranged in uneven rows. Their uniform depth and spacing made the pattern unmistakable. The report described them as subsurface disturbances consistent with shallow interments. When the data reached the survey office, the engineer on record, a man named Declan O'Rourke, contacted the local authorities. His call triggered an automatic response under heritage law. Any discovery suggesting human remains required archaeological assessment. A small team arrived within the week, their equipment bright and modern against the gray ruin of the convent. They took soil samples, photographs, and preliminary measurements. What they found deepened the unease: traces of calcium lime in unusually high concentrations, a substance once used for sanitation or concealment. The church intervened almost immediately. Representatives from the diocesan property office arrived unannounced, polite, and efficient. They thanked the surveyors for their diligence and requested that all findings be forwarded to their office for ecclesiastical review. Within days, correspondence began to circulate between the developers, the county council, and the archdiocese. The language was diplomatic but firm. The anomalies, the church argued, were likely remnants of historic agricultural activity or boundary markers, and posed no cause for public concern. They emphasized that disturbing the soil could risk desecration of consecrated ground. The county quietly accepted the statement. By autumn, the matter was officially closed. The files from the survey were sealed, the archaeologists reassigned, and the planned retreat postponed indefinitely. Local rumor filled the void. Some said the diggers had found small bones and crosses before being ordered to stop. Others whispered that one of the workers had collapsed after uncovering a fragment of cloth that still smelled faintly of lye. None of it was proven, and none of it was written down. In the final documentation submitted to the council, a single paragraph summarized the event. Asterisk, site inspection completed. Ground irregularities determined non-anthropogenic. No further excavation advised. Asterisk behind that bland phrasing, the truth remained buried. The orchard was left to grow wild again, its trees twisting over the same ground that had been disturbed, and then protected, by the same hand that once silenced the dead. And so the hill returned to stillness, as if waiting for someone who would refuse to stop digging. The discovery came from something as mundane as a land deed. In 2011, a postgraduate researcher named Eleanor Hayes was compiling data for a thesis on decommissioned church properties in Ireland when she requested access to archival deeds held by the Land Registry Office. Among the yellowing folios was the original 1907 transfer document for Street Verena's Hill, recorded shortly after the convent's dissolution. The deed was routine in every respect: parcel dimensions, valuation, ecclesiastical signatories, until she reached the final page. At the bottom, beneath the official signatures of the diocesan solicitor and the presiding bishop, was one more name written in a different ink and a finer, more deliberate hand: asterisk, Sister M. Whitmore. Asterisk. No record of such a nun existed in any directory of the Sisters of the Divine Restraint. Hayes, curious, compared the signature to known documents from the convent. Her search led her to the Book of Rest, now preserved in the diocesan archive under restricted access. Through digital copies she obtained with permission, she noted the final entry on the final page, written in a hand identical to the signature on the deed. The words were concise and chilling, asterisk, the last to confess. Close the book, asterisk. The ink, darker and fresher than the others, had bled faintly through the page, as if pressed harder than usual, an act of deliberate finality. Historians had long assumed the ledger ended with Mother Elspeth Duhamel's handwriting. But the strokes here were different, tighter, more angular, with flourishes that matched samples from a later era. Forensic comparison confirmed that they belonged not to Duhamel, but to an unknown woman educated in the early 20th century. The coincidence of name could not be ignored. Monsieur Whitmore. The initial was the same as that of Margaret Whitmore, the woman confined to Bedlam half a century earlier and whose case had rewritten British law. Whether coincidence or bloodline, the connection carried an unease too precise to dismiss. Hayes pursued the lead through parish correspondences and property files until she uncovered a letter from 1908, stored in a bundle labeled Times, Post-Dissolution Accounts, asterisk. It was addressed to the diocesan bursar and signed SMW. The handwriting matched. The letter thanked the church for its continued guardianship of the ground and its hidden souls. It concluded with a phrase echoing the ledger's last words, asterisk. All confessions complete. The earth is faithful, asterisk. There was no trace of her beyond that single note. What unsettled Hayes most was the implication of authorship. If the convent had closed in 1906, and the bishop had signed the transfer that same year, then someone, this Sister Whitmore, remained long enough afterward to record one final entry, one final confession. The thought that a single nun had lingered among the empty buildings, completing the last of the documentation, gave the story a new shape. She might have been the caretaker assigned to oversee the closure. Or she might have been the last witness, the one who knew where the bodies lay. In interviews, Hayes described her discovery with academic restraint, but her notes told another story. The ledger's final line is not conclusion, she wrote. It's testimony. Close the book was not an instruction, it was a plea. And if the signature truly belonged to a Whitmore, then the story of Street Verenas did not end in silence. It looped back to a legacy of confinement, binding one woman's injustice to another's pen. Somewhere between history and inheritance, the name had returned to close the ledger of the lost. The screen opens on images of modern Ireland glass buildings reflecting the sky, crowds moving through Dublin streets, the world bright and loud where once everything was whispered. The narrator's voice returns, low and steady, as footage shifts to courtrooms, newspaper headlines, and hearings that filled the early years of the 21st century. The country had begun to speak about what it had kept hidden for more than a century. Survivors of industrial schools, reformatories, and the Magdalen laundries stood before commissions and cameras, their testimonies unspooling a pattern older than any one institution. The silence that had defined Street Verena's Hill now echoed through every story of women confined, worked, and erased in the name of redemption. Legal historians interviewed for the documentary traced the line backward, through decades of unacknowledged policy, to the 19th century experiments that made such silence possible. Street Verena's, they explain, was not an anomaly, it was the model. A prototype built when church and state still defined morality as management. The Sisters of the Divine Restraint had simply perfected the language that others would later adopt. The Penitent Refuge, the House of Mercy, the Reformatory. Each name disguised control as compassion, discipline as care. What began on that hill as a private arrangement between church and family would evolve into a national system of containment. Archival footage plays beside contemporary hearings. The camera lingers on the faces of women in their 70s and 80s testifying before tribunals, describing long days in laundries that smelled of soap and steam, of prayers said as punishment. Their words mirror the ledgers of Street Verena's almost exactly silence enforced, labor sanctified, the body used to prove repentance. When asked whether the state had known, one historian answers simply, they didn't have to know, the pattern was inherited. The documentary's tone turns reflective, almost mournful. Shots of the orchard fade into courtroom lights. Lawyers reference old statutes, some dating back to the same laws that once protected the sisters from scrutiny. Under those laws, private religious orders were beyond the reach of civil inspection. What happened at Street Verena's Hill remained legal, even holy, under the guise of sanctity. The same framework, nearly untouched, later sheltered the Magdalene institutions until well into the 1992. As the film overlays the names of the convent's 117 women with those of documented victims from the laundries, the connection becomes inescapable. Each system inherited the language of the Last Atonement, service, purity, and each one erased the women it claimed to save. A legal historian speaks over the montage. The law didn't fail them. It served precisely as it was designed to protect institutions from the humanity of those within. The chapter closes on a quiet shot of the ruined convent, its windows hollow, the sea murmuring beyond the hill. The narrator's voice softens. Every nation builds its laws from memory. But when a country forgets its own silence, the past doesn't vanish, it waits. And when it speaks again, it does so through those who survived what should never have been law at all. The wind over Street Verena's hill was sharp the morning the archaeologists arrived, bending the tall grass that had swallowed what once was the convent orchard. In 2023, after years of petitions and legal hesitation, a team of independent researchers from the University of Galway was granted limited access to excavate the ground that had remained untouched since the aborted survey of 1998. Their permit allowed for 30 days of work, one small section of the property, a rectangle no larger than a tennis court. To the church, it was a gesture of cooperation. To the researchers, it was a test of truth. They began with slow precision, mapping the terrain with drones and radar. Almost immediately, the equipment registered familiar anomalies, 27 shallow depressions, aligned in uneven rows exactly where the earlier survey had placed them. The soil was dense with lime and clay, the kind that preserves as much as it conceals. On the fourth day, the first trench was opened. Beneath 15 inches of compacted earth lay fragments of cloth, tightly woven linen, the sort once used for hospital shrouds. Underneath that, the outline of bone, small, delicate, unmistakably human. Each discovery brought a hush over the team. There were no markers, no rosaries, nothing to distinguish one from another. The bones were arranged carefully, not discarded but placed with deliberate symmetry, arms crossed over the chest, heads turned east toward the ruined chapel. In some graves, the remains were intermingled, adult and infant together. The forensic specialist, her voice trembling during the field report, noted that the pattern matched communal interment consistent with unrecorded burial. It was a clinical phrase for something far older and more intimate. Women and children buried as if their existence were an error to be covered. News of the excavation spread quickly. Journalists gathered at the gates, drones hovered above the site, and statements from the diocese arrived almost as quickly as the soil samples. "We await verification," one release read, "and urge respect for the sanctity of the ground." But no wording could soften the sight of what the cameras captured, row after row of unearthed silence. By the second week, 17 bodies had been identified as female adults, 8 as infants, and 2 indeterminate, each aligned perfectly with the dates and missing entries in the Book of Rest. The ledger's numbers had not been exaggeration, they had been accounting. As dusk fell on the final day of excavation, the camera lingered on the orchard's broken earth. The archaeologists stood in quiet formation, their tools down, their gloves streaked with soil the color of rust. The narrator's voice lowered to a whisper, almost reverent. "They planted no trees of fruit here," he said. "They planted their penance. The orchard was not for apples, it was for absolution. And in its roots, the soil still holds their names." The final scene returns to where the story began. The camera rises slowly through the mist, tracing the slope of street. Verena's hill until the ruins of the convent come into view. The orchard below is bare again, the excavation trenches filled and leveled, their soil darker than the rest of the ground. Grass has begun to grow over it, thin and uneven, as if the earth itself were reluctant to cover what it has finally confessed. A drone shot glides toward the bell tower, its stone ribs fractured but still upright, framed against a colorless sky. There is no sound except the wind and the faint creak of metal that once held the bell in place. The restored footage follows, its age apparent in every flicker. Grainy black and white film taken in 1905, when the convent still stood whole. The sisters walking in procession through the courtyard, faces blurred by distance, hands folded beneath their sleeves. The bell rope sways gently behind them, it never moves. The voice of the narrator fades in over the archival hum, calm and measured, carrying the weight of a century. They built their heaven on earth from women who were never buried and prayed over their silence instead of their graves. As the words linger, the film cuts between past and present, the bell tower in ruin, then whole again, then ruin once more. The sound design deepens into a low, sustained note that trembles at the edge of hearing, neither music nor wind, just the echo of what should have rung, but never did. The screen fills with images of hands turning the fragile pages of the Book of Rest, of bones being brushed clean beneath sunlight, of names read aloud in the calm voices of historians who can barely speak them. The letters appear on screen one by one, dissolving into soil, until only the word times, closed times, remains, repeating softly until it, too, fades. The film's final minutes hold stillness. A lone archivist stands beneath the tower, looking upward at the empty space where the bell once hung. Around her, the evening light shifts from gold to gray. A gust moves through the opening, carrying a faint whistle that might almost be mistaken for sound. For the first time in the film, the silence feels alive, not oppressive, but watchful, as if the hill itself were breathing. The narrator speaks one last time, the voice barely above a whisper. Every ledger ends with ink, but the ground keeps its own record. For those who were written out, the earth remembers in other ways, in the dust, in the grass, in the silence that refuses to fade. The camera drifts upward until the tower becomes a silhouette against the fading sky. The wind rises once more, steady and hollow. Then, just before the screen goes dark, a single chime rings out soft, uncertain, like the echo of forgiveness too long delayed.